Okay, testing. Check, make sure.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's Neurology Grand Rounds. I am Franziska Husch. I am a Chief Resident in Pediatric Neurology at the Mass General, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Dr. Jeremy Schmahmann to today's Neurology Grand Rounds. Dr. Schmahmann has not only been a pivotal mentor to many trainees here at the MGH and has shaped countless careers of residents, postdoctoral research fellows, young scientists, myself included, but his groundbreaking work on the role of the cerebellum in cognition and behavior has not only expanded the boundaries of neuroscience, but has also opened new avenues for therapeutic interventions for patients with cerebellar disease. Dr. Schmahmann is a professor in neurology and the director of the ataxia unit here at the MGH, and his clinical and research pursuits have centered around unraveling the complexities of the human cerebellum, investigating its anatomical substrates of intellect and emotion, exploring white matter pathways in non-human primate brains, and the clinical neurology and basic sciences of ataxias and cerebellar disorders. Dr. Schmahmann described the cerebellar cognitive affective syndrome, named Schmahmann syndrome, and his work bridges the gap between cerebellar diseases in the young and the adult, with the cerebellum playing a pivotal role in many pediatric developmental disorders. His accomplishments and awards are too numerous to comprehensively summarize in this brief introduction and include the Distinguished Neurology Teacher Award from the American Neurological Association, the Special Award for Sustained Excellence in Teaching from Harvard Medical School, the Raymond D. Adams Award for Mentor of the Year at MGH, the Norman Geschwind Prize from the American Academy of Neurology, and the Behavioral Neurology Society for pioneering the field of the cognitive neuroscience of the cerebellum. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Dr. Schmahmann.
Thank you, Franziska, so much. Can everybody hear me okay? You can hear me? Thank you for the lovely introduction. It's been my joy to work with you, get to know you over the past decade, and hopefully that'll continue for many years to come. And wonderful to be back here in person in the Ether Dome, to see folks here in person, and also to join with you folks who are on the Zoom call. So our charge today is to talk about cerebellum from a somewhat different perspective. We'll talk about the cerebellar function, its anatomy, its neuropsychiatry, and we'll focus particularly, since we have a pediatric neurology focus today, on its implications for the developing brain. These are the disclosures, some of the books I'll be mentioning, and the scales that I'll be talking about as well. So here is the overview of what we'll be covering today. I'm going to start in Grand Rounds tradition with a case report. We'll talk about the theory of cerebellar cognition. We'll jump right into that from the outset. We'll talk about the systems, neuroscience, and network elucidation of how cerebellum is linked to cerebral hemispheres. We'll talk about the cerebellar cognitive affective syndrome, and then we'll discuss its implications for the developing brain and potential for intervention as we move forward, and then summarize at the end of that. So let's start with the case report, which is the tradition of Grand Rounds. This lays out the foundations of how to think about the challenge of cerebellum and its role in nervous system more broadly. This was a youngster who came to us at age 12 for evaluation, but her problems began age 4 with behavioral problems, global delays, particularly with speech, language, and learning. And finally, at the parents' insistence, imaging was performed, and they found a pilocytic astrocytoma at the midline, which was resected. This is the imaging at age 12. You can see the post-surgical site. Here was the approach through the midline vermis, and then just so you have. Cannot see the mouse. Scott, can you help us find the mouse? So Scott will help us with the mouse, but on the right image is the cerebellar axis, and you can see the location of the surgical approach, which was through the cerebellar midline. Now, although they can't see on the Zoom, I mean, like a double zoom. I think we will need a zoom, a laser pointer for the audience, please. Yes. So they can see the mouse on the screen, but you can't see it here. So the problem that this child presented with, persistent until the age of 12, led to a series of diagnoses, all within the psychiatric domain. They called her bipolar, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, autism spectrum, and OCD, trying to fit her symptoms into a box because they included emotional lability, mood swings, inappropriate behavior, impulsivity, executive dysfunction, impaired working memory, difficulty with math skills, verbal fluency, and perseveration. So the obsessive behavior, the mood swings, the learning problems, and the insistence on sameness led to this range of diagnoses within the psychiatric domain. When we performed an ataxia rating scale, she actually is quite unimpaired, essentially normal. 1.5 on the 30-point scale is within the range of normal. But she had difficulty with, as you can see down the bottom, the Wexner Intelligence Scale assessments, a range of issues: full-scale IQ, verbal comprehension, spatial cognition, fluid reasoning, working memory, processing speed. And we performed the beta version of a neuropsychiatric rating scale, which I'll talk about in a moment, and looking at the domains of attention, emotion, autism spectrum, psychosis spectrum, and social skill set, all of which produced scores that were relatively high. And so we conceptualized this as a problem of neuropsychiatry and cognitive impairment resulting from the cerebellar surgery in midline. And so that sets the framework of what we need to think about in terms of cerebellar role in nervous system outside of motor control, because our ideas about cerebellum from the time of Florenz in 1824, so 200 years ago, literally, Florenz postulated that cerebellum is important for the coordination of movement. Actually, the great luminaries in our field in the late 1800s, early 1900s, we learned about the ataxia, dysmetria, dysarthria, and oculomotor abnormalities as characteristic of the cerebellar syndrome. But I'd like to leave you with the idea that this, in fact, is a cerebellar motor syndrome, and there's a lot more to cerebellum than motor control. So let's jump right into the theory of how this all could take place. I normally do this at the end, but I'm going to start with this now to set the groundworks for how we move forward. And this is what drove me from the beginning back in the early 1980s with this theory, then to look at the anatomy and the neurobiology and the clinical neurology that could be used to test this hypothesis. So the idea is dysmetria of thought, that the cerebellum is an integral node in the distributed neural circuits that subserve neurological function, whether it's sensory, motor, vestibular, autonomic, cognitive, limbic, or autonomic. And that theory is based on two complementary anatomical realities. And the first, as you know, is that cerebellum, unlike cerebral hemispheres, does not have the complexity of the cortical architecture. There's an invariant architecture with only a few small changes throughout cerebellar corticonuclear microcomplexes. But secondly, the other piece of this is that there's a topographic arrangement of connections from cerebellum to the rest of the brain. So that's the dysmetria of thought theory. And the idea is that what the cerebellum does to movement, it does to cognition. So the rate, the rhythm, the force, and the accuracy of movements is applied to mental function, the speed, the consistency, the capacity, and the appropriateness. And so when the system breaks down, you match the unpredictability and the logic of motor control to societal interaction. The question then is, what does cerebellum do? And since it's a reductionist idea, but since the architecture is consistent throughout, the thinking is that the cerebellum does the same thing throughout. The universal cerebellar transform architecture subserves the transform. The idea here is that cerebellum makes things better. It optimizes performance by modulating behavior. So that's a big piece of modulation around a homeostatic baseline. It's the Goldilocks of the brain, not too much, not too little. It does it automatically, implicitly, and according to context. So each phrase in that story gives a sense of how we think cerebellum is functioning. The corollary is that when the cerebellum breaks, it should break the same way, so that you get this dysmetria, and the dysmetria of the cerebellar motor control system produces the cerebellar motor syndrome. The dysmetria resulting from lesions of the cognitive limbic cerebellum is the cerebellar cognitive affective syndrome. So here's a system elucidation of the story. So when I came to this back in the early beginning of the 80s, and I learned from my teacher, Dr. Pandya, we worked on the anatomy of the system. Is there an anatomy that could support these ideas? And so we looked at injections of tracers in the monkey brain in the association areas of the cerebral hemisphere. You can see on the bottom left, inject your tracer in the cortex and the terminations and the pons down the bottom. And in the composite diagram on the right, a color-coded representation of where in the cerebral hemisphere talks to where in the basis pontis, because the projections are from cortex to pons to cerebellum, cerebellum back to thalamus, back to cortex. The corticopontine projection then arises from these association areas, the prefrontal, posterior parietal, superior temporal, perihippocampal, which are all involved in high order behavior, and they have a discrete set of representations in the basis pontus. The details are interesting, but they don't matter so much now. There's a mosaic of overlapping interactions of where these terminations are in pons. Even within a single lobe, like the prefrontal cortex, the map here is the prefrontal cortex injections on the left and a representation of the pontine terminations on the right. There is a specificity of the projections from cortical regions to pontine terminations. Now, from there, the pons, it goes through middle cerebellar peduncle to cerebellum, and from cerebellum back through the nuclei, back to thalamus, back to cortex. And the retrograde transneuronal traces have shown that when you make an injection of tracer in the motor cortex around the central sulcus, there are neurons labeled in the dentate nucleus of the dorsal region, but prefrontal cortex further forward has neurons labeled in the ventral part of dentate nucleus. So there's a dichotomy. This is the work of Peter Strick going back now many years, a dichotomy of dorsal, the dentate, which is motor, ventral dentate, which is more cognitive. And then when you look at anterograde and retrograde transneuronal traces, you see a tie-in between M1 motor cortex and the cerebellar anterior lobe and lobule 8, but injections in the prefrontal cortex are tied into the cerebellar posterior lobe, lobules crus 1 and crus 2 are shaded on the right, as you can see there. These are terms that I want you to become familiar with, as well as you know about the angular gyrus and the prefrontal cortex. Crus 1, crus 2 will need to be part of your terminology as you think about system neuroscience involving cerebellum. There are strong connections from the hypothalamus and cerebellum backwards and forwards. Hypothalamus does more than temperature regulation and food regulation. It's involved in bonding and maternal behavior and mating behaviors. So it's a critical part of the limbic circuitry, and it has direct reciprocal interactions with the cerebellum. Similarly, the ventral tegmental area, which is the origin of the mesolimbic dopaminergic system, key for neuropsychiatry, sitting in the midbrain, has a strong interaction from the deep cerebellar nuclei. And when you modulate the nuclei in the cerebellum, you change the VTA, dopaminergic efferents, and you change behavior in an animal model. And then you find that the granular cells in the cerebellum encode not just motor system responses, but they actually encode the expectation of reward. So at the level of the physiology, you're seeing some fundamental changes now with the optogenetic interventions to really understand not only the connections, but the neurobiology in behavior. And then we have this study using the new genetic approaches to understanding the linkage of neural systems, the work of Dr. DeLuck in her lab. You can look at the different subpopulations in the middle there of the neurons within the fastigial nucleus itself. And the fastigial nucleus subpopulations have linkage to parts of the cerebellum and to cerebral hemisphere that are linked and important for posture and motor control, for arousal, for orienting, for vestibular autonomic function. And so there are subpopulations in the fastigial that are linked with areas in the cerebral hemisphere, cortical and subcortical, that are key for a range of functions, extending way beyond eye movement control and balance, but into high order behaviors and the areas that we know about being important for neuropsychiatry. As you move from the mouse model back into human, back in the early 2000s, we looked at the imaging studies across the range of publications over the years to that date using the newly available analysis for the meta-analysis software, the activation likelihood estimation. And with Catherine Studley and Eva Lera, we looked at a meta-analysis, and we showed that there is a region in the anterior lobe, on the top in the red, with the second representation down in lobule 8 over here, which is involved in motor control. The language representations are seen in the cerebellum on the right hemisphere, which talk to the cerebral hemisphere left, spatial on the other side, and working memory bilaterally in the posterior lobe. We showed the same thing in a single case study, and then in a prospective analysis, we were able to identify this topographic representation on functional imaging, task-based imaging, in the cerebellum of motor, executive, linguistic, and working memory paradigms. Now, this has been taken further. This is what Xavier Guel, who you know as having been a resident here, This is a flattened map of the human cerebellum. Here's the anterior lobe in front of the lobule, in front of the primary fissure. Most of the human cerebellum in the pink is the posterior lobe, and floccular nodular lobe down in the 10. In the flattened map of the cerebellum on the bottom left, you'll see a primary and secondary motor representation, which I've talked about, but there turns out to be primary, secondary, and tertiary cognitive representations using task activation and resting state connectivity through the Human Connectome Project with motor testing, story listening, and working memory. One finds that there are different representations in the cerebellar posterior lobe that are activated by these different tasks. And this maps onto, similarly, the single case that we see on the far right, where you can see, as I showed you earlier, the language, spatial, working memory, and motor control representation in the single cerebellar hemispheres. Now, if you do the same kind of studies, which was done a big decade after our initial work, and you have the same individuals in the scanner multiple times with multiple tasks, you find, as we see here, that there is a full complement of behaviors far beyond motor control. So in the anterior lobe, in 1 and 2 at the top, and on the bottom in the green over here, you'll see motor planning and motor activation. But for the rest of the cerebral hemispheres, working memory, divided attention, narrative, verbal fluency, word comprehension, autobiographical recall, a range of cognitive paradigms that activate cerebellum in concert with the cerebral hemispheres. And this is entirely consistent with what we know from resting state connectivity. This is the intrinsic connectivity network map of cerebral hemispheres, the now well-established map of the sensory motor system in the blue, the frontoparietal connection in the orange up top, the default network in the red, and the dorsal and ventral attention networks in the cerebral hemispheres. These are matched in the cerebellum with the same kind of networks. But look at the topography. On the bottom left here, you see the cerebellar motor system in the anterior lobe and lobule 8, but most of the rest of the cerebellum in the human is linked in with the intrinsic connectivity networks that have nothing to do with motor control. So the frontal parietal network, the default network, the dorsal ventral attention networks, and the salience network are all linked into the cerebellum, but in different locations. And so you have this important idea of topographic representation, not only in the animal models when physiology, but in human resting state and in task activation. And then what Xavier did, just two more studies on this imaging story, is we showed that there are functional gradients in the cerebellum as there are in the cerebral hemisphere. And what this diagram at the top left is showing that the hot red part is the task unfocused, the default mode kind of network, moving to the blue, which is the motor control. There's a gradient from on the one end motor system, the other end the high order system, shown in the middle series task processing and resting state networks, where this is the default network, here's motor control, and here's task focus processing. So you can really get a sense in the kind of a gradient mapping, how you move in the cerebellum as you can in the cerebral hemispheres from the one dimension, which is sensory motor, to the extreme opposite, which is task unfocused default mode processing, which is what happens when you're creating, thinking, imagining at rest. And then finally, we have the idea that in the dentate nucleus itself, which I showed you, the monkey connectivity has differential connections to motor versus prefrontal cortex. With resting state connectivity, you can see that the functional territory in green on the left is for visual association, and for the default network. And here in the midline, we have the default mode in red, sensory motor valence in blue, and visual association in green. And so within the dentate itself, you can subdivide it through functional connectivity, resting state analysis into the different kind of networks we see in the cerebellar cortex and the cerebral hemispheres. So what about patients? And one of the ways we've thought about understanding functional connectivity, clinical neurology, structure function anatomy through the generations of neurology has been in stroke. And we did this initially in the early 2000s, and again a decade later with the voxel-based morphometry. And you can see that in patients who've had stroke, if the lesion involves in the top panel, just the anterior lobe, lobule 5, 6, and 4. So this is the coronal views, the horizontal views, and the sagittal views. This location of stroke produces the traditional cerebellar motor syndrome. But if your stroke spares the anterior lobe and you just get stroke in the posterior lobe down the bottom here, crest one, didn't have stroke in crest 1, but crest 2, 7B and 8A, these are the patients who do not have motor impairment, they have the cerebellar cognitive affective syndrome. So what is that? So the cognitive affective syndrome arises from going to the bedside, talking to patients, doing an exam, and seeing how they perform on a battery of simple cognitive tests, then confirmed in the neuropsychology laboratory. And this is a paradigm patient here, a young woman who's slipped on the ice in Boston. She had a tumor taken out by Bob Ogerman. So she was superbly managed. She has no motor impairment when examined a couple of days later. But we were called to see her because she had a behavioral change. She was disinhibited. She was not being herself, disrobing in the corridor, being rude to her parents, and quite bland affect. And at the bedside, she has difficulty bisecting a line. She does it multiple times. She has difficulty drawing a clock. She has agrammatism in her sentence. She repeats herself. And so this pointed the way to the more comprehensive evaluation, showing what ends up being a set of difficulties that patients have when they have lesions of the cerebellar posterior lobe. And it's executive function, spatial cognition, language deficits, and the personality change. And these break down into problems of planning and step shifting and verbal fluency, abstract reasoning and working memory. And this manifests in real life with people having difficulty organizing their own life. All of this is required to structure your day, structure your life, have long-term planning. Spatial cognition is a way to get a sense of the gestalt of the world. How do you interact with the world in a big picture way? Language deficits as agrammatism, difficulty with the actual structure of language itself, aprosodia, flattening of the language intonation, and anomia, trouble finding words. I'll come back to that in a second. And personality change when the lesion involves the cerebellum midline with the blunting of affect, disinhibition, and inappropriate behaviors. And this is now the third cornerstone of clinical ataxiology, with the other two being the cerebellum motor syndrome and the cerebellar vestibular syndrome. So now you have the motor syndrome from the anterior, the vestibular syndrome from the vestibular cerebellum in log of 10, and the rest of the cerebellum, the cognitive limbic cerebellum, when damaged, produces the cognitive affective syndrome. We looked at this a bit further, and Francisca has been a key player in many of these studies now going forwards. So Xavier and Francisca worked together with me to define the nature of the language impairment. It's not an aphasia. It's not a Wernicke's or a Broca's. There is an anomia. But patients have difficulty with how you use language to interact. So metalinguistics is the way that you interact with somebody using language. So metaphor and ambiguity and inference, joking kind of behavior. What do you actually mean by the way you're using language? And then how to express oneself in a grammatically and contextually appropriate way. This is metalinguistics, and it's impaired in patients with cerebellar injury. And similarly, reported by patients' families is, my husband or my wife isn't the person I used to know because I can't get through. There's a blunting of affect. They don't have any empathy. And in fact, the cerebellum contributes to social cognition as tested in this really interesting task called the theory of mind task, trying to understand someone's mental state by looking at the eyes. So it's the reading the mind and the eyes task, which is impaired in people who have autism, and it's impaired in the patients who have cerebellar disorders. Now, with respect to the children, we showed right off the bat, this is 2 years after the first paper in 1980, 2000, that when you look at children who had tumors taken out, this is with a postdoc, Lisa Devinson, and Alice Cronin-Gulam at BU, that when you look at the children who had tumors taken out, this is the midline medulloblastoma, postoperative lesion, these folks have difficulty with the same constellation of troubles. Problem solving, visual spatial organization, expressive language, memory, and the regulation of affect. The affective piece, I'll come back to in a moment, because when the midline is attacked, you have this dramatic change in the way that these children interact. It's almost like bipolar disorder in the same visit. On the one hand, quite aggressive, whining, on the other hand, happy, complacent, and quiet. And there's a real fluctuation in the cycling in the behavior with the midline lesions. And here's the copy of the Ray diagram, immediate recall, and then the delayed recall. And this almost looks like a fragmentation of ideas, a loosening of associations, if you wanted to use a psychiatric term for a performance on a visual spatial task. Which takes us to the next story, which I mentioned up the top with our case description, that when you review the words of patients and my own evaluation of patients and what the families are saying, you land up with a neuropsychiatry of cerebellum, which broke down, as I can conceptualize this, into a problem of attentional control, emotional control, an autism spectrum, a psychosis spectrum, and social skill set that is getting in your face, don't have a sense of personal boundary, personal space. And with each of these domains, we conceptualize this as too much or too little, sort of like overshoot, undershoot in the cerebellar motor exam. And this is similar to the positive and negative syndrome scale of schizophrenia, where you can think about a neuropsychiatric phenomenology in a way that is excessive or is diminished. And we're working on this as we go forward. So we're many years down the road now, and there are a number of synthetic papers, other studies looking at this, consensus papers on the cognitive affective syndrome, a meta-analysis, the cognitive profile, cerebellum and emotion, cerebellum and social cognition. And I'll talk about this in a moment, the pediatric postoperative cerebellar cognitive affective syndrome, what happens in children after they've had tumors taken out. So there's a whole story now, which you should feel free to review on where we're going now. And the essence of science is replication. And this has been replicated now multiple times in multiple different populations and age groups across the world. A way to get at the evaluation in a way that doesn't take the whole day in the neuropsych lab is the cerebellar cognitive affective syndrome scale that Francisco worked with us to develop. And long story short, is a whole battery of tests with patients, and we took from that the essence that would then correlate most closely with the issues. What the scale does is it takes the 10 domains that are most clinically relevant, that are identifiable at the bedside. Each is normed, and if you fail 3 of these in our study, you had cognitive affective syndrome and differentiated patients from controls. No control in our group failed 3 of these 10 domains. So it's a new way of thinking about cognitive evaluation at the bedside. This was used in the natural history study of the ataxias with the National Ataxia Foundation, work that's now about to be completed, looking at the different spinocerebellar ataxias in adults. SCA3 is the most common. And of this large group of patients, almost 50% met the criteria for definite cerebellar cognitive affective syndrome. So some are earlier in disease, some are later. So just across the spectrum of presentations and length of disease, a good number of patients are having difficulty with those issues that we identified as critical for cerebellar cognition. And in addition to that, in the recently developed patient-reported outcome measure of ataxia, what we found is that when patients describe their own symptoms, that's the key to development of a problem. It's patients reported their own symptoms. A good number of them include the mental section, which is both cognitive on the one hand and affective on the other. So patients are telling us in their own words, I have a problem with multitasking, or I have a problem with mood, or problem with regulation of my own behavior. So these are clinically meaningful to patients' families, and we need to pay attention because patients are annoyed with doctors who think it's all just in their head, when in fact, the way I like to frame it for them, it's not in your head, it's in your brain. And understanding that is key to their own agency in moving forward. So let's then get to the core of what I want to talk about now in terms of the developing brain. And there are a number of different disorders in which this manifests. So I'll start with Francisca's work. She's very passionate about ataxic telangiectasia. And what we have thought about AT through the years is a purely motor phenomenology. And we had to twist the arms of the Ataxic Telangiectasia Children's Project to actually allow us to go ahead and do this work. And in fact, you find that as the children get a little older, as the disease evolves, they become more impaired in the neuropsychological test battery. Spatial disorganization initially, but in the older age group, ages 6 to 10, they have more of the same issues: executive, expressive language, social cognition, emotional psychological processing. And as the older ones become more troubled, they have the same idea, same issues, but more severely. And here again, interestingly, is this kind of loosening of association of the fragmentary piece of the Ray Oscarth figure. It's a tough thing to do. This is a 10-year-old girl. It's tough, but this is a healthy control, and this is a patient with AT. So there's something about the conceptualization that just falls apart. Now, the surgeons just left the room in their conference, but they're seeing this a lot. So the tumors that occur in children occur predominantly in the posterior fossa. More than 60% of tumors in kids are posterior fossa. It could be medulose, pilocytic, astrocytomas. And what's happening is that the surgeons are finding that anywhere between 15 to 30, 40, 50%, depending on what center you're in, when they go into the midline, they take out these tumors, the children a couple of days later have this dramatic syndrome, which is like, oh my God, what is that? The child stops speaking, goes completely mute, and they have, or almost mute, and they have this range of psychiatric phenomena and cognitive changes that are very dramatic. So there's now a group put together of surgeons, neurologists, neuropsychologists, cognitive scientists, looking at this. And we came up with this consensus paper on the what's now called postoperative pediatric cerebellar mutism, also posterior fossa syndrome, characterized by this delayed onset of mutism or reduced speech and emotional lability after this surgical attack. Common features are hypotonia and oropharyngeal dysfunction. It may often be accompanied by the cerebellar motor syndrome, cerebellar cognitive affective syndrome, and brainstem dysfunction with long tract signs and cranial neuropathies. The mutism is always transient, but the recovery may be prolonged, and every child with mutism lands up having cerebellar cognitive affective syndrome. Now, another trainee from here, Aaron Bowes, with his group now in Iowa, has been very creative in showing, as other people are now replicating, that the lesion responsible is when you get the cerebellum midline and the outflow tracts. So the deep nuclei, the superior cerebellar peduncle leading to the thalamus on the left, the medial dorsal thalamic nuclei, and the anterior thalamic nuclei on the bottom right, which are linked into limbic and associative regions of cerebral hemisphere. So we have a sense of the outflow tract that's critical, and surgeons are now learning how to go about doing the surgical interventions to avoid causing this damage that results in this complex syndrome. Taking a step back in terms of development, this is the work of a group showing the, this is Scott and colleagues, showing that in the morphometric analysis of the human cerebellar development, there's a marked increase in cerebellar volume as you move into the towards the end of the pregnancy, so now 28 to 32 weeks, more than in the cerebral hemisphere. So the growth of cerebellum and later in the pregnancy is more than in the cerebral hemispheres, and shown particularly by Limperopoulos et al. With an old classmate of mine, Adria Duplessis, that as you move into the third trimester, the cerebellar growth is exponential and more than brain volume or intracranial volume. So the cerebellar growth is marked as you move into the third trimester and even beyond into the first year of life. So Emi Takahashi with Ellen Grant and our group looked at the development of cerebellum using imaging to try and understand what's going on in the cerebellum as you see these changes. And this is a snapshot of a few studies here, 17-week infant and the adult. Here's a middle cerebellar peduncle that becomes much more elaborate in the adult with its complexity. And here we're seeing middle cerebellar peduncle at 17 weeks, 21 weeks to the top right, and then 31, 36, and 38 weeks. And what you're seeing is that the MCP fibers become more elaborate and go out into the white matter laminae of the cerebral hemisphere, of the cerebellar hemisphere fissures. And similarly down the bottom right, you'll see that the vermis, which is you need to point it on the zoom. They can see it. The vermis is in the top, little dots around the vermis, and the bottom right, it's down here. The study over time shows the elaboration of the white matter folia longitudinally from one side to the other in the cerebellar vermis. So you're seeing an evolution of the anatomical complexity, which is identifiable very nicely in the fetus, and this will be key in looking at developmental disorders. So what happens if you don't have a cerebellum? These are rare cases. These are probably not really agenesis, but disruptions where you get a cerebral hemorrhage and the cerebellum doesn't develop. And there is a range of important manifestations on the full scale IQ. This is a Z-score graph where 0 is over here. These are standard deviations below the mean. The IQ is impaired. The ray figure, visual spatial, is impaired. Learning somewhat impaired. And on the far right, all these over here are the executive functions, the FAS, phonemic fluency, semantic fluency, trails A and B, all impaired, and the ray figure on the bottom is markedly impaired both for its copy and its delay parameters. In a less dramatic form, and critical now for thinking about preterm birth, we're dealing with the long-term consequences of children who are born very preterm. And as neonatal care becomes increasingly sophisticated and the very young are living longer, we're now coming to terms with the fact that there are other issues we have to grapple with. It's the same kind of idea as happened with the kids who are surviving tumors. okay, we've saved your life, but now what about the quality of life? And here's an example of extreme prematurity, 24 weeks of delivery, and you see at birth, at age, the top child, the twins, age 4 and age 14, you can see a shrinkage of cerebellar cerebellifolia. And the second twin, age 1 and age 14, a shrinkage of cerebellifolia. And the question is why? What's going on here to actually have a long-term consequence on the development of the cerebellar fissures and folia over time? And that's work that we'll be working together on with the team at the Martino Center. Tapping into cerebrocerebellar connectivity in the infants who have cerebral hemisphere lesions, ventricular megaly, periventricular leukomalacia, hemorrhagic infarctions. Compared to those with term birth, we see the mean cerebellar volume on the graph on the right. Contralateral to a cerebral hemisphere injury is a cerebellar hypoplasia. So the diastasis is a functional change over time. So a cerebral lesion uses a smaller contralateral cerebellar hemisphere. But you can go into cerebellum itself. And if you have hemorrhagic infarction in the cerebellum, this remarkable finding from the Children's Hospital, now Washington National Group, is that in addition to expected neurological abnormalities, these children whose lesions are confined to cerebellum have expressive and receptive language deficits and a range of behavioral and social impairments that meet autism scores in 43%. So this is a dramatic turning upside down of our understanding of basically old-fashioned cerebral palsy. The cerebellar injury is producing not only motor system impairment in some, but these marked impairments of behavioral regulation that fit within the autism spectrum. And they followed up on the study by looking at those with more focal injuries to show that when you have cerebellar injury and you look at the cerebral hemisphere volumes in these different quadrants, you find that when the volume of the cerebellum is affected by the stroke, but the volume that they're studying with morphometry is the cerebral hemisphere. When there's a motor control problem, the volume decline is expected in sensory motor regions. When you have autism behaviors in the kids now at 3 years, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex has a decreased volume. And in terms of cognition and expressive language, the changes in the cerebral hemisphere volume after the cerebellar injury is in the premotor and midtemporal cortical volumes. And so what you're seeing in the children in real life, taking the neurobiology and systems neuroscience from the anatomy and the imaging into the clinical world, is a cerebellar injury produces a system change in cerebrocerebellar connectivity and a concomitant change in neurological function. Which takes us to so where I want to start wrapping up, which is these two major psychiatric disorders, autism on the one hand and schizophrenia on the other. Autism in the kids mostly, schizophrenia in older individuals and into adults. Margaret Bowman and Tom Kemper, who were early to the game of cerebellar cognition and my teachers at Boston City Hospital in the old days, showed that in children who die who have autism, there is a smaller set of nuclei, the top right diagram, and the deep nuclei are impaired compared to those the control brains. And there is a change in the neuronal intensity and density in the cerebellar posterior lobe, cognitive cerebellum. And when you look at the tuberous sclerosis mouse model, which is a model of autism spectrum behaviors, a work from Catherine Studley, who was my postdoc here now doing great work in Washington, there is a change in the connectivity between cerebellar cross 1 and cross 2, which is the lateral cognitive cerebellum, and inferior parietal lobule and medial prefrontal cortex. And that change in the mouse model is related to kind of repetitive behaviors, and they can try and rescue the mouse by doing stimulation with neuromodulation of those cerebellar regions and the vermis. So we have now a so what in terms of this connectivity. And the so what plays out in work we did together with Roscoe Brady and Mark Helko at Beth Israel. In schizophrenia, you can look at functional effective connectivity between cerebral hemisphere and cerebellum. And in the schizophrenia patients, what Roscoe showed is that when you stimulate the cerebellar vermis with TMS, you produce a change in the positive and negative syndrome scale of schizophrenia that is causally related. So now you have an intervention that produces a change in the neuropsychiatry of the schizophrenia patients by stimulation of the vermis. So this comes from, as you go to neuromodulation, comes from my work back in 2010, when we asked the question, if the cerebellar vermis is involved in behavior and particularly neuropsychiatric phenomenology, what if you were to try and upregulate the cerebellar vermis and therefore its effect on upstream systems in the cerebral hemisphere when you apply this to patients who have schizophrenia? So in a proof of principle study, we took these 10 subjects. We did cerebellar vermis stimulation with intermittent theta burst stimulation, and Asta Demirtos, who's back in Turkey with Oliver Pasqualiani, showed that there is an improvement in the depressive component of their behavior. The negative symptoms of the positive and negative symptom scale of schizophrenia improved. The depression and the analog scale for their attentional control improved. So we see in a proof of principle study, firstly, it was safe, most importantly, and secondly, there was an improvement in very difficult refractory symptoms in this patient population with schizophrenia. Others have shown this to be true subsequently, and the work in this field continues. Why could this be? Well, just to go back to the science for a second, and I'll finish with the second case, is that when you stimulate the cerebellum in a particular location, you change the networks upstairs. So remember I showed you the networks in the cerebral hemisphere, networks down in the cerebellum. Well, if you go for the particular location of network in the cerebellum, you can modulate what's happening upstairs. So there's a physiology to this interaction. So you can simulate the vermis and you change the dorsal attention network, but you go to crust 1 and crust 2 and you change the default mode network. And the reason this is happening is because of the bottom diagram, which is the physiology. The common theme here is that you control the temporal dynamics of these networks. So this is the universal cerebellar transform dysmetria of thought idea. You're changing the network in the same way, that's the universal transform, but in different locations. That's a topography of the connections. It was this idea that then led us to intervene in this young woman's case. She came to us over a decade ago. Age 14, a hemorrhage in the cerebellum, probably a cavernous malformation. And for 2 years plus, she was devastated. Persistent mutism, no language, occasional high-pitched sounds. She would follow instructions only occasionally. She was aggressive. She would strike out. She wouldn't eat. She had to have a peg tube. She wouldn't keep her clothes on. She was bedridden, but only a relatively mild dysmetria, actually. And the patient's parents came to us having had her go through multiple courses of rehab to say, what can you do? Can you help? So working with our team at Spalding with intensive rehab for a few weeks didn't change. We then did intermittent theta burst stimulation. And remarkably, within a matter of a few weeks, a month or so later, she started to improve. She was able to start talking, took out the peg tube, she gets her clothes back on, and she goes back to school and makes the dean's list, which has some aspects of the cognitive affective syndrome still. But I had a Zoom call with her with her parents just a few months ago, and she's doing amazingly. So we jump-started something, exactly how TMS works, how you can produce a permanent change that hadn't been before. There's a work that will need to be studied as we go further forwards. But I think that we're in the stage now, as you all know, reading in literature, of the neuromodulation as a way to try and intervene in a patient's life to improve quality of life. And what this does here, it adds a new wrinkle to this. It adds the idea that all these interconnected networks are clinically meaningful, and the cerebellar piece is a critical component of the distributive network, subserving not just the motor control, but the cognitive behavioral systems as well, depending on where in the cerebellum you have it. So let me end with a summary, the what, why, how, and therefore. There is a triad of clinical ataxiology. The motor system, you know well, we've learned this from the time we were beginning medical students. But the vestibular syndrome is part of this. And the third now is the cerebellar cognitive affective syndrome. And the why is because of the dysmetria of thought theory. The cerebellum does for cognition and emotional, does for motor control. And the why, because of the transform theory. It's the repeating architecture across the cortex, but the topography is critical, because it determines which part of the nervous system functional stream is being impacted by the cerebellar injury. And therefore, and why this is important for you, the so what, is that we need to know this for patient care, to understand it, to recognize it, to detect it, to explain to families, explain to patients, and to treat it, and as in the case of the surgical cases, to try and find ways to prevent it. We need to identify the role of cerebellum in the non-ataxia neuropsychiatric disorders as in autism and schizophrenia, and think about ways to intervene with neuromodulation. So the summary perhaps, is this too much? Is it too far? I think we have to see how far is too far. The first is the cerebellar role in nervous system function is ancient, is necessary, and it has evolved in concert with the progressive elaboration of association areas subserving high functions in mental health. So that's a statement of what we know to be a fact. The evolution is a mosaic evolution in terms of association areas and cerebellar posterior lobe. And cerebellum has been there throughout evolution, so it's critical. What is it doing? Why has it been there all this time? And the idea here is the cerebellum does for cognition and emotion, what it does for motor control, because of the evolution of its connectivity to association areas of the cerebral hemisphere. And we can explain the cerebellar cognitive affective syndrome by these two ideas, the transform and the dysmetria of thought. And then the cognitive and neuropsychiatric profile follows damage to those parts of cerebellum that are critical for that behavior, unlike what's going on in the motor system. And I think where this may take us to, and the question now is still open, if you look at autism and schizophrenia and you find a cerebellar role with such fundamental neuropsychiatric disorders, the question then is, how far does this go? Can we make the statement that the dysmetria of thought theory underlies maybe much of neuropsychiatry? The positive and negative syndrome scale of schizophrenia has dysmetria of thought embedded in it. So this is a question that remains open. And I think that we think about the brain as an interconnected whole, where each node with its own universal transform according to each specific architectural arrangement does something important. We now move far beyond the idea of the silent frontal lobe and the silent cerebellum. And as Marty Samuels would teach us, patient with cognition after cerebellar injury, we used to say, we see this, and now I think we can see this and we can explain it and we can understand how it has manifestations going forward. So all this work is done in collaboration with teachers, colleagues, mentors, students, many of us I've mentioned as we've gone through, and funding organizations that have helped us to do this over the years. So thank you for the opportunity to join you and share these ideas today. And I look forward to working with you going forward. And I hope that we've sparked some interest in the trainees to come and join us in this field. And happy to take any questions. Thank you. So I'm so okay.
So Jeremy, it's a fantastic talk, very eye-opening. The parts of this that are a little bit frustrating, actually cholangioplasia, where every cell in your body has a DNA repair problem, or preterm birth, where you lose a lot of work, cerebellum. But so your attention sort of naturally focuses to those surgical or imagined lesion. Okay, here's something that really has changed. But those, they so often fit. Whereas your fMRI data show all these highly correlated areas in the hemisphere that for whatever reason people seem to tolerate better surgically than midline lesions. So I just wondered, have you done any fMRI before and after surgery to see what exactly changes in those correlations? I said midline, so much more vulnerable than should be the same deficits in the service.
So Dr. Slade is asking why is the midline lesion produce more trouble than the hemispheres? I think there is an answer to that, but there's a caveat to the question. I think that since we know about the cognitive changes in the hemispheres, one needs to test for that to find it and ask patients and families in detail about that. So firstly, are we missing it? But secondly, there's two pieces to the answer. One is that the behavioral changes can be dramatic, and that really gets your attention. It's sort of like the Alzheimer's patient who lands up in the nursing home, not because they can't remember, but because their behaviors have changed. I think the behavioral modulation that falls apart is very dramatic. So that's the first piece. The second piece is that when you're going in the midline, you're getting the nuclei as well. And so when you damage the nuclei, you get the efferent. And so it's not only the cortical injury, but it's cortical and white matter and nuclei. So it becomes a more complex injury. And so you're adding to the anatomical burden of the system destruction. That's how I would think about that.
Very amazing, incredible work again. And one thing I didn't hear you mention is cerebellum. Outside electricity. Even process. Traditionally associated. Is there a story there? Maybe one.
Dr. Cole's asking about the role of basal ganglia in this. No, you're exactly on target. So yes, I was focusing on cerebellum, drawing attention to that node in the system. But the understanding in the old days was, and the nice thing is, even from anatomy, things change, that the basal ganglia and the cerebellum are completely unrelated to each other, two ships passing in the night. But it turns out that with the retrograde transsynaptic neuronal traces, Peter Strick and others have shown that through these steps, through the subthalamic nucleus and through the brainstem, there in fact is a connectivity between the cerebellum and the basal ganglia. We've become more attuned to the fact that even in the ataxias who have cerebellar ataxia like SCA8, the other ones often as well, SCA3, there may be dystonias and cramps and maybe even some career-form movements as part of the clinical features from cerebellar injury without basal ganglia involvement, but the basal ganglia certainly are interacting with cerebellum, and so there's a story there about the clinical neurology manifestations of a pure cerebellar injury that may have basal ganglia type features to it because of two things. One is connection to basal ganglia. The other is what we learned from physiology in the mouse, that depending on the way that you stimulate the normal neurons, Purkinje neurons of a mouse, the input of the stimulation can produce tremor, dystonia, or ataxia. So the actual firing patterns of the Purkinje neurons can produce different kind of clinical manifestations. So you're exactly on target. Basal ganglia I came into this through basal ganglia because I training at Boston City Hospital, Derek Denny Brown wrote about basal ganglia in great detail, didn't look at cognition, but Wally Nader at MIT said, well, hang on a second, could there be cognition in basal ganglia? So in fact, it was that idea that took me into cerebellum. Could that be cognitive as well as motor? So these are exactly parallel, and the two are interacting with each other. Missy.
Genetic cerebral weakness. So those are next and these genetic weakness. So on one hand, being relatively limited to their syndrome, the structural element based on the work I have in the past. They developmental ways you can explain months. But then we can share innovations with these hospitals instead of the company is like pre-direct or AT, where their own stuff. Yes, as well. In there, do you think this paradigm for any patient with ATXC these patients benefit studying structurally on the TNS.
Thank you. So Dr. Walker's asking about the Dr. Walker's asking about in the genetic ataxias, is there a role for neuromodulation, for example, for behavioral and some of these other disorders? Well, your question and Dr. Stady's question have something in common, which is I want to make it clear that I'm not. The reason that we chose stroke to look at cerebellar cognition was exactly for the reason that I don't know in the degenerations where the pathology is elsewhere. So in a sense, we now have the answer. So it's okay for us to look at the more widespread diseases because we have a focal injury, a pure hemorrhage, as in the kids, or pure stroke. We now know that answer. So we're not asking the question in a patient who has SCA3, is cerebellum involved in cognition? We're asking, what is the contribution of the cerebellum to the cognitive impairment? I think that by defining where things are, by defining the nodes in the system as clearly as we can, we may find ways to intervene. And it's possible in the case that we're looking at, for example, at the moment where a patient had a small focal cerebral hemorrhage, led to profound anhedonia, amotivational syndrome, depression. PET scan showed exactly what we expected: contralateral, prefrontal, medial, right side hypometabolism. TMS hadn't worked to the lateral hemisphere, so we went to the medial hemisphere, and that made him better. So you can get into the system somewhere else. It's the work that Mike Fox has been championing, which is looking at the network as a whole. Which part of the network is damaged, and how does it affect the syndrome? So there may be different manifestations in the way that ataxia is different than Parkinson's, different than hemiparesis. It may be that where you are, which lesion in the network is affected may have different kinds of manifestations, and the opportunities are there for intervention. But the question is wide open. So I'm not giving you the answer, but I think the question is well framed in terms of how do we go about making life better for patients who have these diseases that are genetic, that are progressive over time, and while we're trying to find clever ways to cure the gene diseases, how do we make their lives better for them in the meantime? I think Peter Rosenberg had raised his question, raised his hand. How do we do this here?
Jeremy, thanks for I'm glad that the R&D team came with us today to see this fantastic presentation. So first of all, thanks for the work, for the guidance, for the mentorship of so many brilliant colleagues. We all look up to you and admire and proud. Question is related to progressive multiple sclerosis, the cerebellum. And as we're talking about identifying the cognitive syndrome, we all know in the MS clinic that is the most complex, the most challenging clinical situation we face. And looking back to many cases, more so because the cognitive or the executive linguistic difficulties than just the motor on itself. So two questions: whether your working prompts for patients with global cerebellar dysfunction, whether you have been able to highlight how the cognitive affects even more than the motor. And second is whether you've been working on fMRI, the objective data of improvement with transcranial stimulation.
Oh, thanks, Marcelo. Thanks for your nice comments. The two parts, one is, there are three parts: the role of cerebellum in MS and cognition. Secondly, role of neuropsychiatry in the patient's quality of life. And third is imaging and neuromodulation. I'll start with the last one. That field is exploding. And I think we'll learn more as we go about what you're seeing in terms of improved network connectivity and behavior with neuromodulation. That work is starting and will continue. Eric Cloud and I we had a fellow work with us and actually showed that in MS, the lesions in the brainstem that involve the middle cerebellar peduncle getting information into cerebellum, as opposed to the inferior cerebellar peduncle from the spinal cord, the people who had the MCP lesions but not the ICP lesions had changes in cognition more than the folks of the ICP. So the cognitive story is actually tied into this. And there's a very nice field of work on cerebellum in multiple sclerosis specifically. And I think you make a really key point. I think it's good for us all to know that, you know, I have patients, younger patients with febrile ataxia in a wheelchair, and they're going on, you know, as adaptive trips up Mount Kilimanjaro. I mean, they're living a life. All right. So people's spinal cord injuries are, you know, playing in the Olympics and they're doing the Boston Marathon. So motor system damage is a big deal. But what makes life fall apart for people is when neuropsychiatry intervenes. So it's not only the forgetfulness, it's the forgetfulness and the irritability and the anger and the aggression, or the inability to actually empathize and connect. And I think that as neurologists, we need to hang on to this piece of neuropsychiatry, because it's not only in psychiatry. This is what we talk, the psychiatry team that comes and joins me in the ataxia clinic. Every patient has some piece of neuropsychiatry that is key to their management and to the optimization of their life. So I think you make a really important point about the higher order behavior, sort of mental function, as part of our job as taking care of the well-being of patients with neurological disorders. Dr. Frank.
Sure. Thanks for the call. You want to say, I speak on cerebellum to HSC for that. But actually, I wanted to ask you why the existence of behaviors of right, important honesty. You look at the whole thing before borderline, posterior frontal injury, and in fact, if you think about inferior cerebellum, more vulnerable with the traditional components and all. you should have seen it, it's not, I've read the paper.
There actually is an answer to that. Dr. Frost wants to know how Gordon Holmes taught us everything you know about motor cerebellum. How come he didn't see it? And there actually is an answer. He didn't want to see it. They had absolutely no interest in sort of neuropsychiatry. There was an active resistance. If you look at there's a paper by Critchley and Brain describing the view about neuropsychiatry of the early greats. And that's sort of what led to the branching off, I think, of those fields. And Denny Brown, who was a giant in our field, talked about all the issues of parietal lobe in terms of the actual, what we now think of neuropsychiatry, the sort of squishiness, which is the core of life. That was not their interest. So first you had to care about it, look for it, and then know about it, and that wasn't their interest. So there's no criticism there. I think it's the way things were, and life has evolved. And in the old days, the silent lobe, the frontal lobe was a silent frontal lobe; it didn't do anything. And then we had the tamping incident of our patient with frontal lobe injury. So the temporal lobe did nothing until HM had his middle temporal lobe taken out. So I think we learn as we go, and I think that's the nature of the field. But these are giants who taught us everything we need to know. Alice is asking a question. Cerebellum is important for freezing reflex. Overactive freezing is debilitating in PTSD and anxiety. Not to mention horses balking at the fence and steeplechase. What can your research suggest about potential treatments that would dampen the freezing reflex in affected patients? So I'm going to go back to Mike Fox here, who also had a study on freezing and showed that, in fact, people who have freezing in Parkinson's have a cerebellar signature there as well. So there is a linkage there. It may have to do with Andy's question about cerebellar basal ganglia interaction. And I think that once the question is asked, we can find a way to address that. So I think neuromodulation may be a way to go. Where do you stimulate? Well, maybe we have a new window. If cerebellum is linked to all these different brain areas, maybe we have a way to find how we get in there more easily than doing deep brain stimulation. Peter Rosenberger raised his hand. I'm not sure how we get him to ask a question. Peter's asking about cerebellar mutism. So I think we've dealt with that. So what is cerebellar mutism? It's a great question. I had a colleague and a wonderful linguist and neurologist, Peter Marion, who died much too young, who thought that the cerebellar mutism syndrome of the kids who had tumors taken out is the maximum manifestation of the cerebellar cognitive affective syndrome. And I remember well a patient that actually Anne saw as chief, and in chief's rounds, was one of our patients in the original paper who had post-infectious cerebellitis, and she wasn't talking. And the residents were saying, maybe she's just depressed, and Anne was saying, this is more than just depression here. She had a verbal fluency of like 2 animals a minute, a marked reduction in her verbal fluency, which is common in the cerebellar acute injuries. And I think that the cerebellar mutism may be regarded as a disruption of the network interaction with the supplementary motor region important for praxis. So it becomes, in essence, a profound apraxia of speech. And it is, in fact, a speech apraxia in some of the patients who have cerebellar injury. So to answer Peter's question about mutism, one thought is that it's an apraxia of speech, how you actually find ways to form words. So it's more than motor control. It's the concepts behind motor system that allow you then to produce words. So it's this overlap of, on the one hand, aphasia, which it's not, dysarthria, which it's not. It's apraxia of speech. How do you find the motor program to produce language? And the mutism may be the maximum manifestation of an apraxia of speech. That's one way to think about that. Is it the right answer? I'm not sure, but it's a nice concept. And I think we're up in time, right? Thank you so much, everybody.